This is a new video on factors influencing growth and development. In this case, we're going to focus on education and skills. So I'll often say to students, a good way to structure your answer is to say what it is, say why something might work, say why it might not work, and then say what it depends on. So we'll apply this methodology to this particular topic of education and training. So in this case, what do we actually mean by education and training? Education tends to describe a process by which young people, that is anyone between the age of between 4 and 18, are in school acquiring general skills that are useful in a wide range of industries. So these general skills might include literacy, basic maths, science, etc. Training is something that firms do, so this tends to take place after a young person has left school, and in general training tends to be about specific skills, vocational skills that are required by a particular industry. So in this case, it might be an apprenticeship scheme whereby a young person can learn the ins and outs of plumbing. So training is a private sector activity undertaken by firms. So at this point, I'd like to acquaint you with a trendy buzz phrase that you really should know. And this phrase is human capital. So governments and businesses invest in human capital when they educate and train young people. So let's now dig into some possible logic chains that might explain how education and training might lead to higher levels of economic development. To calculate the Human Development Index, there are three variables that are averaged together. So we've got GNI per capita, we've got life expectancy, and we've got knowledge as measured by mean years of schooling and expected years of schooling. So therefore you could argue that if the government spends more on education and makes primary or secondary schools compulsory, that will directly increase that country's Human Development Index score, because the mean years of schooling will increase if you make education compulsory. Education and training will also improve the skills of the people in the workforce. As a result of that, output per worker should increase. This is because educated labour will tend to work faster and make fewer mistakes. So the same group of workers will now be able to produce more in total. Public spending on education is an example of an interventionist supply-side policy. So if the government spends more on state education, that will improve skills, that will increase output per worker. So as a result of that, the long-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right, because, as I say, the same group of workers will now be able to produce more in total if output per worker has increased due to education. The other thing to bear in mind is that government spending on education will also increase aggregate demand. This is because government spending is a component of aggregate demand. So the combined effect then of public spending on education is that it will increase both long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So as a consequence of this, what we'll get is economic growth, non-inflationary growth of MY1 to MY2. And that economic growth has got the potential to create material progress, which in turn will generate economic development. You could also argue that education might improve the quality of life in non-material terms by creating sort of general enlightenment that might lead to less sexism, racism, or other forms of discrimination. So by empowering people, that lifts the quality of life. All of a nation's resources, human resources, can be put to better use if gender roles, for example, are less strictly defined. It's often said that there's a link between education and democracy. In societies where educational standards are higher, the people tend to find it easier to hold their democratically elected leaders to account. One simple reason for that is that if people can read, for example, because they're educated, they'll be able to acquire more information about what's going on in their society and the decisions that have been made for them by their elected officials using their tax dollars. And if you can read, you're more likely to be able to question politicians and hold them to account when politicians are abusing the trust that have been placed in them when they've been democratically elected by the people. So you could say that there's a link between education and holding politicians to account, which makes for a better functioning democracy. And obviously democracy is an important factor that affects economic development, as per Tadaro's third core value of development, which is freedom from servitude. That people essentially have economic development when they're able to influence the big decisions that affect their lives. So in summary then, let's look at some logic chains. So we'll start off with government spending on education. That'll increase mean years of schooling. In turn, that will directly increase the HDI because mean years of schooling is one of the 3 variables that's averaged to calculate the HDI. If the HDI goes up, well then that obviously means that there's been economic development taking place. Again, if we spend more on education, that will improve skills and knowledge. That will create productivity growth, which then generates long-run growth, which should increase GNI per capita if the increase in economic growth has been faster than the growth in population. So if GNI per capita increases, that will also increase HDI because the HDI also includes GNI per capita as one of its 3 component parts. So again, we get back to economic development. The third route through, we could talk about the demand side impacts of education. So when the government builds schools, that creates an injection into the circular flow of income. That could create some positive multiplier effects. So for example, to build a school you might need bricks. So the company that supplies the bricks will have an increase in its order books. That will require the brick manufacturer to raise their output, creating a second round increase in GDP. On top of that, the brick maker might have to take on extra workers. Those workers will now have a wage, and they might choose to buy a car with that wage. So that will then create extra business for the car manufacturer. They'll need to raise output, creating a third round increase in GDP. And so this multiplier effect could go on, creating some more economic growth, which hopefully is going to increase GNI per capita, which then feeds back through into the HDI. Final linkage is the idea that education should create a more educated population. That should lead to more enlightened attitudes and less discrimination. Possibly you might be more inclined to be able to operate a functioning democracy, less corruption. So that would create non-material progress, which then feeds back into economic development. Keynesians see market failure everywhere, so they would argue that there's an absolute necessity for the state to get involved in providing education, because if it's left to the free market, it will be underprovided and there'll be a deadweight welfare loss and society's welfare won't be maximised. So this really is a theme 1 micro topic, but there is some relevance here to development. So let's quickly remind ourselves of the analysis. So You would say that when students think about buying education for themselves in the private sector, they only consider their private benefits. So that might be the pleasure that they get from studying, or probably more likely the wage premium that they hope to enjoy as a result of consuming the education. So the marginal private benefit curve occupies the same position as the market demand curve for privately supplied education. When private schools and private universities think about supplying education, they only consider the private costs. These are the costs that affect their profits. So, for example, the wages of the teachers that they employ, buying and upkeeping their school premises. These would all be private costs. So the supply of private education is driven by the marginal private costs of supplying it. So if we were to leave it to the market, Q1 private education would be supplied at a price of P1. Now, the issue is here that education will create positive externalities in consumption. When students go to school and university, they'll acquire skills. Those skills will create external benefits, such as increased productivity, and the third-party beneficiary will be employers who go on to hire those students. They're third parties because they didn't consume or supply the education that they're benefiting from. So the existence of positive externalities in consumption means that the marginal social benefit of private education is greater than the marginal private benefits. As you know, allocative efficiency occurs at the output level where marginal private cost equals marginal social benefit. So the allocatively efficient level of education is Q2. So that's higher than the market equilibrium. And this is where the undersupply market failure comes in. Society would have its utility maximized if Q2 was supplied, but private suppliers of education would only want to supply Q1. So we've basically got market failure characterized by underproduction. To get students to buy the allocatively efficient quantity, we would need a price of P2. So you could also say that at the moment the market price of private education, P1, is too high. It's above the allocatively efficient price. So again, what I'm trying to communicate here is that for example, from a Keynesian perspective, Keynesians would argue it's absolutely essential that governments get involved in providing education, because if it's just left to the free market, there will be a market failure characterized by undersupply and overpricing. So to correct that market failure, the government must intervene in this market for education, and the intervention would take the form of compulsory provision, compulsory consumption of education by the state. So what we'll look at now is why the government's spending more on education, why it might not work, why it might not trigger economic development. So this is evaluation essentially. Well, obviously a lot will depend on the type of education that's being supplied. So if it's education that doesn't enlighten, doesn't really provide young people with skills that they need to become economically productive citizens, you can spend all you want on education and it probably won't create any economic development. In fact, some types of education could actually reduce economic development by spreading kind of unenlightened attitudes towards other human beings. Also, we've got to be careful about what actually is being supplied. So when the government spends money on education, are they really supplying education, or are they really instead supplying state propaganda? Obviously, in the case of the Nazis and the Soviets, it was propaganda. Young people weren't taught to be enlightened human beings. Um, they were taught to be ideologues. So we could think about universities and the issue of safe spaces. Is this really helping to create economic development? Society advances when ideas can be pulled apart and criticised. This obviously is incompatible with the idea of a safe space where discussion of ideas that is verboten. Many of these people who want to deplatform other people who have different points of view will kind of smear these people as fascists. These people really are fascists themselves. They're the 21st century equivalent of book burners. You know, this is a picture again from Nazi Germany, where the Nazi state encouraged young people to burn books that contain views that the Nazi party disapproved of. So just as in 21st century Britain, we don't really have diversity of thought, same as what happened in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. The views of Jewish authors, they weren't allowed to publish books, and books that they had published had to be got rid of. So there's a degree of irony in those signs, I think. These are people that worship the totalitarian power of the state and look for the state to define what can and what can't be said. For me, this runs right against the principle of a free society and freedom from servitude. In a highly economic developed society, there's freedom of speech. There's certainly not compelled speech. So all ideas can be discussed and evaluated. This is a very worrying development. Where they burn books, they will in the end also burn people. Is this the picture of somebody who's tolerant? So we have the rise of the new authoritarians. Their goal is to split society up into warring identity groups. History shows that this doesn't end well, whether that's Hitler's concentration camps or Stalin's gulags. It really doesn't matter. Authoritarianism, both its left-wing and its right-wing versions, are both equally repugnant and counter to any sensible view on economic development. So let's take an assumption here that maybe politicians are trustworthy. Even if you do assume that and they're not monsters, you could argue, well, how can a central planner running education really know what skills are required by employers in a modern economy? So this was kind of Mises' point about the so-called socialist calculation problem. So if you put education in the power of the state, even if politicians are decent people and they're not corrupt and they're not monsters, which is quite a leap of faith, will they actually even have the information at their disposal to centrally plan the type of education that will be most beneficial for the economy? Another issue, I guess, is magnitude. So the government can spend more on education, but that will only create development if the increase in education spending exceeds any increase in the school-age population. And that can be an issue in developing countries where population growth rates can be quite high. The opportunity cost of the government spending taxpayers' money on education also needs to be considered too. So if the government chooses to finance education by increasing corporation tax or increasing income tax, then ordinary families will have less of their own money available to spend. So There's often this argument that we couldn't privatise education because there'll be lots of people who couldn't afford to go private. Well, that's only the case if the state is taxing households at very high rates because they have to fund very high levels of public expenditure. If you started to privatise services and let people choose their own types of education that they wanted to buy from private suppliers, they would have more of their money available if they were taxed less heavily by the government, because the government didn't have to tax them so heavily because they weren't spending a fortune on public services. Another way you can evaluate is to just say what it depends on. So what would the impacts of education spending by the state on development, what would those things depend on? So I guess the most obvious one is the quality of the central planner. Can they make decent decisions? What's the goal of the central planner? Is it even development? Or is the central planner's goal with regard to education something completely different? Much would also depend on how the education programme is going to be financed. So if it's financed by running fiscal deficits, the national debt will increase. The national debt is the total stock of debt. When the national debt goes up, every year the government will be committed to paying more in bond interest. So where's that extra money going to come from? Well, hopefully the investment in education will increase GDP. A bigger economy will generate more tax income naturally. So all will be well and good if the economic growth created by education creates a big enough tax windfall to pay for the extra expenditure on debt interest. On the other hand, if the central planner screws up, they increase the national debt, they spend more on education, but that education just doesn't deliver in terms of economic growth. Puny economic growth means that the tax windfall created by that growth will also be pathetic. And as a consequence of that, the government is going to really struggle to pay the bond interest owed on a bigger national debt. The only alternative is that the ordinary population take a hit and they have to pay a higher rate of income tax. So it's possible that education spending might not create economic development if the education spending fails to deliver the economic growth boost needed to pay for the education spending. The concept of public choice theory is also relevant too. According to public choice theory, politicians are no different from the rest of us in that they, like us, will pursue their self-interest. So in the case of education, a politician pursuing their self-interest might push educational contracts by the way of big companies, and those big companies go on to coincidentally, mysteriously employ the said politician in a high-paying non-job once their political career ends. So just thinking about some modern day examples of this, during the coronavirus fiasco, the government promised that they were going to spend public money on laptop computers, which were going to be distributed to disadvantaged children. So what's the goal of the politician there? Is their goal really to help poor people, or is their goal to get a kickback from the company that got the big contract from the state for the laptop computers? Public choice theory would say that you shouldn't overlook the possibility that politicians may do corrupt things. So let's turn our attention to business training. In developing countries that are primary product dependent, there aren't large-scale manufacturers of high value-added goods. There's not much training going on because there's not much business there. So you could argue, well, to develop, there needs to be a trained workforce. But where's that trained workforce going to come from if there aren't any businesses there to do the training? So yes, there is like a chicken and egg situation here. Who's going to do the training if there's no businesses there in this developing country? Keynesians would argue, or maybe the government needs to step in and help private business, and maybe with things like subsidies or tax breaks for any expenditure made by private companies on training. But as you know, in economics, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So if the government's going to blow money on training tax breaks or subsidies for training, where's the money going to come from? In all likelihood, the government will have to increase tax either now or at some point in the future if they want to go down the route of running fiscal deficits. So yeah, maybe businesses end up paying through higher rates of corporation tax, and if firms are paying higher rates of corporation tax, that means that they've got less money available to pay for training in the first place. So if politicians really were serious about helping businesses to spend more money on training their staff, maybe the best approach would be to leave alone, to adopt a laissez-faire approach. So as former US President Ronald Reagan once said, the 9 most scary words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And it's a joke, the joke being that whenever the government tries to help private business, they don't help, they make things worse. And in this case, they make things worse because they end up taxing businesses more heavily to fund their harebrained, stupid, insane government spending plans that fail to deliver growth, that fail to actually help private business. Because those decisions are made by politicians who've never been near a business themselves. So they don't understand what they're trying to help. Or maybe they're just trying to help themselves with your taxes. So we've come to the end of another economics video. This time the topic's been education and training and how it can create development. So I think more or less everybody would agree that education and training are very important in terms of generating development. This was certainly true of the Asian tiger economies that invested very heavily to good effect in education and training. The big question is whether the bulk of that investment should be undertaken by the state or whether it might be better for the private sector to spend the money on education and training instead. Austrian economists would be wary of handing the state with too much power over something so important as education. As Mises says here, he who is unfit to serve his fellow citizen seeks to rule them.